Hello and welcome to TaAF Talks, where we share what we're learning to help you create change and make a difference. My name is Jamie Ward, the Programme Manager for Together an Active Future. And alongside me, we're going to need a bigger boat. It's Ken, the Great White Shark Massive. How you doing, mate?
Very well, thank you. I've never recorded Great White Shark before, but we are going to talk about my favourite podcast that we've ever done right now.
Okay, so I'm going to call it out now, guys. There's an elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room is Ken has recorded a podcast without me.
Yay!
And it was really good, which, I've got to be honest, I was hoping for something less. And so what we're doing this time is actually a little bit differently. We're recording an intro to that podcast. And basically this is my way of making sure I'm still on it.
Yeah, you're on it. Say something outrageous and you'll be the most memorable moment.
So this is an intro to the podcast you're about to hear, which I've already heard, and it is an absolute banger. And so Ken, maybe if you want to set some context for the podcast and who was on it and why.
Yeah, so we had a really good conversation with a lady called Ali Donnelly, who's the Executive Director for Communications and Digital Marketing at Sport England. That's a mouthful, isn't it?
Wasn't it? Yeah, I thought well done with that.
She and some of her colleagues from Sport England were visiting Together an Active Future here in Burnley, and we were really talking about the whole day. How do we understand and then communicate the place-based work or the systems work that the pilots were involved in? And so we had a good half an hour conversation broadly around how do you tell the story of something that is felt rather than seen, that's not immediately obvious to the naked eye what the work is.
Yeah, and again, just to give you kudos for one, when I'm not here, you nailed that 30-minute podcast as well.
Yeah, bang
when
on.
we do it, we aim for it and get like 38.
It was like 30 minutes and 10 seconds or something.
And miles more succinct and effective.
Ali is exceptional on this podcast.
Yeah, she's great. So, and maybe if we direct maybe for a couple of things for people to listen out for, because there was quite a lot of great content, but maybe we'll pick out one each that's worth kind of listening out for that really connected with us. So I'll go for one, and she talks, I think it's towards the back end of the podcast, about message discipline and this idea of work out what you want to say and then make sure you and your team are saying it consistently all of the time and really hammer home that message so that people start to create a connection with it to then be able to open up different conversations. And I thought it was a really strong one, that just really nailing message discipline.
Yeah, and she talks about what that looked like when she worked at 10 Downing Street as well, so really interesting. My bit that stood out was connected to that about, Together an Active Future is a great example of where there's so many different strands of the work going on, so many different stories to tell, and you've got to be selective not only about which are the best stories and the best bits of work to share that could draw people in to learn about about the rest, but also even within just one work stream, what's the key message? It's not the only message, and that doesn't mean the other message is not important, but you can't tell them all, so make sure you choose carefully and then be consistent with message discipline about what those are. Being
selective and really kind of focusing, that's great. So perfect, without further ado, listen to this, probably the best podcast we've done so far in this season, and that's because Jamie wasn't there, and that makes me evaluate what the future of the podcast is going to be.
Definitely going to reduce your pay.
Enjoy, everybody.
Welcome to our latest edition of our TaAF Talks podcast. I'm not with my normal colleague Jamie today, and so it's going to be a bit different, but we've upgraded. I've got Ali Donnelly with me from Sport England. Ali, welcome, and thanks for joining us. Just share with us, introduce yourself, a bit about you, your role at Sport England.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm an executive director at Sport England, so I look after our communications, our marketing campaigns, and our digital work, and there's an innovation and partnerships team in my team as well. There's about 30 of us, and we do all the things you'd expect a kind of classic communications team to do, and as well as that we look after big behavioural change campaigns like This Girl Can, We Are Undefeatable and so on. And obviously one of the things I do in my role is try and tell the story about our investments and our resources and the time and money that we put into various interventions, and one of them is obviously the reason that I'm here today.
Yeah, so we spent, Ali and I and a range of colleagues from Sport England and Together an Active Future, the panel local delivery pilot, spent the day kind of exploring what local delivery and place-based work is, and actually one of our big challenges in Pennine has been how do we now start to share and tell the story of our work? And one of the ways we've captured it is this idea that Sport England's typical work, if you like, pre-local delivery but often still existing, is there's like a product, there's a programme. I can go and see more people playing football, I can see a new leisure centre, I can see a campaign that your team might be doing, but the local delivery work perhaps is more felt than seen, and so we've explored that bit today. And what we're going to explore on this podcast is this idea of how do you tell a story, how do you explain, articulate something that's felt rather than seen. And so just want to we'll explore that a bit together, and I'm hoping you know more about this than we
we'll
do.
Find out.
Just tell us a bit. When Sport England launched their kind of local delivery pilot scheme, where were you then in terms of your take on local delivery, what it looked and felt like for you?
Yeah, so the launch of the LDPs was before my time, and they were up and running by the time I joined Sport England. But what I can say is when I came and had them explained to me, I didn't quite understand what they were, and I definitely fell into the classic mode of thinking about what are the programs they deliver, what can I go and see, is there sport and physical activity happening in the pilot that is new as a result of our investment. And so I went to see one of the pilots quite early on, and I was still new in my role, and the idea of kind of place-based working was new to me. I previously worked in government communications roles at the Treasury number 10, where you spend most of your time kind of firefighting, living day by day. You're not really thinking strategically in terms of what's happening from a comms perspective anyway in communities. So all this was quite new to me. And I think over the last few years, as the work of the LDPs has grown and developed, and as we've deepened our interest and investment in place-based working, I've gone on that journey too. And partly today for me was about continuing to put the piece of the jigsaw together and to move myself away from thinking about programs and on the ground delivery, and think about what are you changing within a system and how can you influence, how can a really small group of brilliant people in places around the country align all the great things that are happening and bring them together. So that's where I'm at. But I do think, to the point you're alluding to, it's difficult to communicate that, because if you're not working in it, or if you don't have the pleasure, as I have, of having some brilliant colleagues who really understand this, it's complicated and it's not straightforward, because it's not something you can just see, as you say, feel it, or it takes a long time. It's not something that is, inverted commas, announceable. That's what we talked a lot about in government. What have we got that's announceable in the next few weeks? This isn't really like that. And so you have to have some patience. And, I'm still, no, I'm not at the top of the mountain of the journey yet, but I'm definitely a lot further up than I was a few years ago.
What are some of the key things that are emerging for you? Because I think we've all been on this, we're all on, not been on, not completed. We're all on this kind of personal journey of discovery of what this means and what it might look like. What are some of the key things that are starting to emerge for you as important?
Yeah, there's a few. I think one is definitely around co-creation, which is such an obvious thing to say, isn't it? But it's so surprising and depressing that sometimes you go into communities and you see an amazing facility that's not used, or there is infrastructure in other ways that isn't quite being taken up. And what you often find, of course, is because the idea was top down, or it felt like a good idea at the time, but nobody in the community was asked about what they actually wanted. So I think there's definitely something in the place-based work that we're doing, and you can see it in the pilots, that is about bringing people, obviously the users of the services, together to say, how do you want this, where do you want it, and when. And I think that we've seen that in West Midlands in particular, around the work we've done investing in the Commonwealth Games and in and around the areas there. It was definitely not about, let's build a shiny new complex here where the people of Sandwell or wherever can use it. It was about, where should this facility be, or where should this service be. And so that's definitely one. So this idea of doing it all together. The other, I think, is really just recognition that great things exist in places, but sometimes they're not joined up, or people don't know about them, or the provision is very clunky and isn't really aligned with the idea that you might just want to have access to a service smoothly and simply. And you guys have given some really good examples of that today with your lifestyle hub. I think that was a very good explanation about a service that the idea of being referred to a service in a quite clunky and complicated way that might just see someone drop out and say, oh, I can't be bothered, and it just seems really complicated and hard. So there's definitely something about the core people in the LDPs being given time and space to take a step back and say, what is actually happening here, and how can we align and make that better? Because actually, probably everybody delivering those services is probably crying out for that, but they haven't had the opportunity for someone to come in. I mean, the last thing is the time and space. So, I was definitely guilty at the start when I joined Sport England 2019 of asking people, what are the stories here that we can start telling? What is what's happening here? What are the outcomes? Where are the numbers? How do I know these LDPs actually work? Whereas I think what I've definitely realised, and what others, of course, at Sport England already knew, is that that's not what this process is about. This actually was about taking the time and space to allow people to step back, to learn, sometimes to fail, and be fine about that, and to not beat each other up for the desire for an outcome immediately. So I think those are the kind of things that I've lodged in my brain over the last few years, and definitely today as well.
I think it is one of those really tricky things, isn't it? We discussed earlier today, and we probably mentioned on previous podcasts, but on one of our very first events when we talked to people about, what is the stuff in, we were trying to identify gaps in like provision, but when we mapped out everything that existed, in some ways there was almost too much stuff going on, but we were definitely covered for enough programs, delivery, facilities, groups, activities, whatever it might be. And so as you then begin to explore how do you connect people to all of those things, you're operating then in the shadows, if you like, because all the stuff that's happening is visible, but it's been visible for ages, for years and years. And so one of the things that we've wrestled with in the pilot is most of our work is then behind that, probably in two key areas. One, trying to engage with communities in a really meaningful way to understand the barriers, what prevents people from connecting to it. One of them you mentioned there, they just don't know. But the other being then how does that stuff change in a way that they also engage more with the people who perhaps struggle to connect. And some of your work has been, I suppose, some of your campaigning work has been aimed at people who, directly into communities and into people's homes and lives in terms of behaviour change type stuff. This Girl Can, We Are Undefeatable. I mean, talk to us a bit about what you were trying to achieve with those and how perhaps they fit into some of this work as well.
I mean, I think there's definitely synergy and alignment with the core kind of work of a campaign like This Girl Can and what you're doing here. And the reason I say that is because equally what This Girl Can is about is knocking down the barriers that stop more women and girls, women in particular, from getting active. And when the campaign started out, that barrier was fear of being judged. And so that's why the ads looked as they looked, and that's why the messaging sounded as it sounded. It was about it's okay. It's okay to look like this and feel like this, and so on and so forth. I think one of the things we have learned though, so when we talk about behavioural change campaigns, we talk about tackling three things. Giving people three things: confidence, opportunity, motivation, because those are the kind of ingredients around actually changing someone's behaviour, and that's a well-versed model for lots of behavioural change campaigns. I think the campaign initially, for the first few years, did give people motivation, and it did give people some confidence. But what we found in recent years, it didn't give people opportunity, because it's an ad campaign, right? So what we've been doing in the last few years, since I've been there definitely, is looking at building opportunities. We've got this amazing brand that has huge credibility. People know what it is. The numbers are really high around recall and understanding of the core message. And we've launched a bunch of interesting programs recently to sit alongside that. So we've got This Girl Can classes, taken up now at, I haven't got the latest numbers, but multiple gyms and leisure centres, and it's a kind of beginner's class to fitness. So I think when you're building on something that's now 7 years old, and saying, okay, we've done something really good here. We've taken an insight, fear of judgment. We're looking at enjoyment now as well, and we've kind of boosted people's interest. But actually what we found is that some of them had nowhere to go then. So there is some synergy with the work here, although obviously the model is different, because the things, services exist, core, training sessions or walking classes or swimming pools, they're around us, but what is stopping, what opportunity doesn't exist for a person to get up out of the house and do that?
Yeah.
And it goes back to this idea that, and it's a very simple refrain that we often get from people who don't work in this space. Why don't you do a campaign just telling people? I get this a lot. 5-a-day campaign really worked for fruit and veg. Everybody knew it. Really successful intervention from government, still exists today. And why can't you do that for activity? Why can't you tell people they need to be active for 120 minutes, whatever it is for your age group a day? And what we know is you can't. It doesn't make any difference. You can't tell people that. They know that exercise is good for them. It's actually all the other bits chipping away. And the same is true for you. Everybody who lives in this area, nobody is ignorant to the fact that exercise makes you healthier and playing sport makes you probably happier mentally. So that's not the problem. It's all the rest of it. And so you're actually doing the same thing that we're doing, just in through a slightly different lens. I talked earlier as well about some of the ignorance around some of this work, and I don't know if you come up against that, the idea that if you tell people, why can't you just show them the swimming pool or give them the money to join the gym? Wouldn't that work? And it just doesn't, does it?
No, it doesn't. And I think what's really interesting for me is I'm trying to figure out, and I've been thinking about this for a while, is the campaigns that Sport England have worked on, like you mentioned there, aimed at the public, but actually we're trying to do the same work, but just at a different layer. So with almost like the deliverers, the organisers of all of that stuff. Similarly, around helping them to have the confidence and the motivation and the opportunity to do things differently, to bridge the gap. And what are the learnings that we can take from the campaign-y type work that we could translate through to our engagement and communication work with those people, with system conveners, organisers, leaders, who sometimes feel under pressure from above to do certain stuff, pressure of or just stuck in this is how we've always done things kind of mindset. And one of the challenges I think for the physical activity sector is that it works. So if I'm running I work for a leisure trust and we run a range of leisure centres and they're full. There's loads of people using them, and there's tens of thousands of people in our borough who are active in already. In fact, the majority of people are active already. And so, from a really kind of, if I'm a deliverer in the system, well, why do I don't need to change, I'm smashing it. And that's some of the challenge as well, in that similar sense of helping people to see that the world can be different.
I suppose in a crude sense, the thing you'd say to those people who think they're smashing it because they've got the numbers is, well, you're actually missing a huge market here because X% of people here are inactive, and so they're the people who, let's say you work for Nike, they're the people who haven't bought your shoes yet. So why aren't you? If you were Nike, you'd actually be focused on those people, right, who haven't bought your product yet. You wouldn't probably be focused on the Nike buyers because they're going to buy your shoes anyway because they really like Nike shoes, right? That's a bit of a crude example, but that is how, I think that is a persuadable way of explaining to people, actually we could do so much more with so many more people. I mean, but it's really interesting because the kind of connection with the campaigns and that, like the two things about campaigning that really work for Sport England are, one is they are undeniably insight based. So this girl can, and we are on Feature, which is our campaign to help people with long-term health conditions, where they start from is a place of knowledge. So we spent X years or X months talking to women, and this is what they told us, and so we know this will work because they've literally told us, so we're going to go and do that now. And so I think in a different way, you also have you're from a place, you're working in this place, you are speaking to people, you kind of know the numbers and understand what's going wrong because you are sitting with people, talking to them all the time. That's really powerful because often organisations don't know that. I'm often surprised when I talk to sports, and I won't give examples of specific sports, and you say, they'll say we've had a drop off of male adult players, let's just take an example, and you say why? They don't always know.
No.
They make strong presumptions. And that's partly because they're not sitting in places with young adult men asking them. They're sort of saying, well, post-COVID X has happened. And like, do you know that? Or are you just kind of having a guess based on... So that is very powerful. And I think the other thing that always works, for us anyway, is just the human kind of stories around the changes that you make. And those kind of programs that are being run that do work in a way do work better because you've helped them and supported them, and the tangible difference they make, that's what always works, isn't it? You know, here's a great example of a life that's been changed, or a group whose, you know, their whole world has been opened up because of the way in which we've helped them to change. It's that sort of, they're the ingredients, I think.
I wonder if, I mean, just thinking that we've not discussed this before, so I might put you on the spot slightly. We've not discussed it today or even thought it previously, but I wonder if, in a similar fashion, we've got these 12 local delivery pilots who have got knowledge about how change can happen within a place that can create more accessible opportunities for people to be active.
Yeah.
Is there work potentially to be done in terms of campaigns, but that are aimed at new places, for want of a better word, aimed at people like me and you who are working within the system around these key ways of behaving, key things to do? Is there potential for some interesting campaign work that's aimed at local government officers and the NHS and things?
Well, I think that's a great point. It's a different type of campaigning, but I think at its heart it's about, you know, raising awareness and changing behaviour, which is essentially what they're all about. So yeah, there probably is. I mean, there's also a sense that I get here today, and generally when I, you know, deign to leave London, which is that there's a lot of learning and knowledge that Sport England has, you know, developed and is continuing to develop through work like the LDPs, but not just, you know, through lots of work that happens all around the country, that probably we could get a lot better at packaging up and explaining and sharing with people. And I think sometimes when we do that, when we go on regional or national platforms, I'm always sort of slightly taken aback by how, you know, really engaged people are and happy people are with the insight and the kind of learning that we've got. So I think maybe one of the takeaways for me today is we just need to think about ways to get better at that. I mean, I think one of the things, we've got a new phase of the Scarcan launching next spring, and we talked recently about when we did the last one in the very start of 2020, and we were in London, we did the BFI in the South Bank, and we had Claire Balding hosting, and all the kind of people you'd expect to come to that went to that. And later, I think we all realised somewhat guiltily that actually we'd missed a massive trick by not working with our core cities, by not working with our LDPs, and so on, to actually, you know, the women in London is not the target of this Scarcan, right?
Yeah,
it's a national campaign. So
yeah.
We are talking now about how do we pull together interesting tools, resources, when we go out again in March with a kind of new phase, and bring it to the whole country. How do we help people who are working in this space to take that knowledge and bring it into their own work at Women and Girls? So there's a bit of a watch this space, but there's also a definite takeaway for me that we could be doing more.
I think, you know, as we're talking now, it seems almost more and more similar, or use the word synergies, I think, between the work, in that, you know, the This Girl Can campaign is really about engaging people emotionally as well. And one of the things we've talked about today, and I prefaced this at the beginning of the podcast, was this idea of telling stories of things that you feel rather than see. But in some ways, like, that is storytelling, isn't it? Storytelling is all about that emotional connection with people, and creating a space where people can, where you remember almost the lessons from the stories, you know, within the story as well. And so we're wrestling with this idea of, you know, things that are felt rather than seen, but actually that isn't the real essence of storytelling, and there's something in that campaigning storytelling that we perhaps haven't done much of, partly because the learning is only just emerging. But that seems like a really exciting opportunity over the next 12-18 months for us to do that.
Yeah, and it's funny, like when I remember being interviewed for the role at Sport England, and after the interview, the second interview, we went to a room with the other exec and business kind of chemistry meeting, and several of them talked about storytelling in local areas. And I said, well, where do you want those stories? You know, they said, well, great to have you in so we could start telling some of these stories around the country. And I said, well, where do you want the stories to be told, and who are they for? And it sort of meant, you know, a few people sort of looked at me a little bit blankly. And I think that's really important to work out before, because it sounds great, doesn't it? We've got great stories to tell. Let's tell them. Where do you want to tell them? On a website that no one looks at, or what is it? So I think the thing you work out first is is there a purpose to this? And the purpose, I guess, for you soon is, well, we have some meaningful learning to share that we think will benefit everybody else. And two, sometimes it's about building your reputation and banging the drum for your own work, and that's a completely valid reason. And then it's about where, like, who are we reaching out to here? Who do we want to know about this? And that will really inform the strategy that you have. So if for example, you think, all I really want to do is tell the people of Burnley, where we're sitting today, about some of the work we're doing, why it might make a difference to them. So that's a very different approach to, I really want Sport England's board and chair to know about this, because that would be very different formats of your storytelling. I think the heart of it is always then the same. It's about people, and the best stories are the ones that move you, or the ones that stir you emotionally, for better or worse. It might make you cry, it might make you laugh, it might make you really angry, but that's what it's about. And I think you showed us a couple of things today where I think at the core there are some really good stories there. The changes you've made to GP referral service and the way you've affected that, there's a great story there. The work that the Croatia football team and what they are doing and how you've helped them to do that, amazing stories. You already had a great video of that work. The Beat the Streets programme, I mean, great, the pictures just bring that to life so well. So, but I think before people are often guilty of going straight into thinking about this being in a newspaper or this being on a video on YouTube before they think, what is the point of this story and who's it for? And I think that's just a thing to keep going back to, and then not to beat yourself up if it doesn't quite land, because you just, you're learning all the time. I've done countless things where the paper hasn't picked it up, or if something ends up on your newsletter internally as your last resort, you're like, but whatever, you lived and learned.
I think that's really useful. I think for us as an LDP, and I would think for many people working in places, and I think you're right that certainly in Together That's the Future, we feel like we've got some stuff that will be useful for others, and that we're kind of interested by and proud of the things that we're learning. There is something about wanting to share it because that's good for Pennine Lancashire as well. A place that sometimes we feel a bit overlooked in Lancashire, and actually to raise the profile of Lancashire we think benefits us and our local people. But you're right, why are you telling the story, and then importantly to who?
Yes, yeah.
Who do you want to care, and who cares?
And it might be that when you start going through that process, you think, I don't need to think about this for 6 months because I'm not ready on any of this stuff. Yeah. And that's fine as well. Yeah. But I think there's sometimes a jump to, let's get this content, and then we'll think we'll worry about who sees it later. Yeah. Actually it's the other way around.
It's really interesting. So it probably as a bit of a wrap up, you've given some really good insight there that's interesting for me, and this idea as well of what would a campaign or storytelling to say local government officers, for example, look like, is something interesting that would perhaps take away. But if you were in a local delivery pilot in a place now where if you feel like you'd figured out the what and the who, what are some kind of key tips, I suppose, or things to be wary of that from a storytelling or a messaging perspective you might share?
Yeah, and I think one of the things is that you've got to get some consistency around what you're saying. And I think if you look at Uniting the Movement, which is our current strategy, we worked really, really hard, whether it read like that or not, we chose a core narrative there. It's about tackling inequalities. It's about, where no matter your bank balance, your gender, your background, we know there's a barrier for you getting active. We repeated it pretty regularly throughout the strategy. On the day, we all talk to that language now, tackling inequalities, if you don't say it, like if you meet a Sport England person, don't say that immediately. And that's really important, to work out what is it you want to say and make damn sure that all of you say it all the time. Mm-hmm. This is our story, this is our narrative, this is what we're doing here, and we'll just keep telling you that, because that, this is what politicians do really well, right, when they campaign. Get Brexit done, you can laugh at all of that stuff, but it absolutely works. And I'm not talking about, sloganeering in the work here, but it is about people then connecting with you and saying, oh yeah, I know that Uniting the Movement's about tackling inequalities. I know that they're not just funding the big NGBs anymore. In fact, they've reduced it. People can tell you that story now because they quite grasp it. So I think that's one thing, is getting your story straight. What is it? Write it down, and then pick out. We won't have time now, but we had a presentation recently from somebody who ran and set up the government digital service, and he had some amazing insight around the simple things. They took like hundreds of government websites and turned them into gov.uk. Right. One place where you now go when you type in, I need to put to get my car taxed on or whatever. Yeah. But they had some really great language, if you look it up, around how is it, like, how do we motivate everyone to keep on this track of what we're about? clear and simple. Like, and I can't remember any of the things, but it was very impressive at the time. Yeah. And it's the same, right? So like, what is your story? What are you going to do? And then I think it's just about being really clear who you want to talk to. So, you know, is it the people who work in the local authorities? Is it the people who are out delivering on the ground? Is it the public? It seems to me less probably the public than others. Right, yeah. And then you just hammer it and say, all right, you have a strategy for this, and who's going to talk to this person? Who's going to you start picking them off. You're all talking the same language. You're all popping up on your, you know, forums and panel sessions and webinars and podcasts that are relevant to that audience. Don't bother with the ones that aren't, by the way. You know, like, it's lovely. You know, I used to work for ministers, and they would always say, I really want to be in the FT. And you say, why? You know, because they read the FT, right? But like, if you work for a minister in the cabinet office, which is where I started out, and the things that we were doing, it's not relevant to the FT. And so you have to try and get rid of that. Like, you know, I'd love to be in the Guardian. Well, that's not really the target market for this. Actually, it's about where are the forums that these people that we want to influence are reading? What are they looking at? You know, what interests them? Like, where are the places? Where do they get their news? Who do they listen to? So I think it's just about being clear on your message and your story and repeating it, and then working out who you want to tell that story to. The rest of it's easy. The tactics fall into place once you know those things, right? Okay, after that you can say, great, we'll do a newsletter, a podcast, we'll do a workshop, we'll do a, you know, whatever, a walking lunch or lunch and learn where we tell this. That bit's easy. Anyone can Google PR tactics, right? Like, that's the easy bit. Yeah. It's this bit here. Am I getting this in front of the right people? And am I saying the right things? And lastly, are all the people who work for me saying this? Because one of the challenges of Sports England is a lot of people work there, and you know, we're all over the country, and I found message discipline to be difficult, not because people aren't interested in it, but because I don't see them all the time. I can't sort of work with them on a day-to-day basis to say, if you're going out to this thing, make sure that you're talking about this. And that's why United in the Movement of Strategy text was really important, because people could see it, and we just keep talking the language, and osmosis eventually gets through, I think.
I think that consistency is really interesting. I think and the big challenge we've got within the pilots, you know, so Sport England have already produced some written kind of reflection documents and stuff, you know, narratives about the pilots, but because it's complicated, I think we've not done a great job collectively or individually in Pennine in identifying the key messages that we're going to go with. Perhaps because there's so many, but there's probably something to bear in mind of maybe you can't tell the whole story. So which bits are you gonna
be fine about that?
Yeah. Be fine about it.
You sometimes stall at the start line because of that, because you just say this all just looks overwhelming and big, or you go big and it makes no impact, and everybody comes really disheartened, and you just think, oh, we're all useless at comms, or I can't do this. That's happened to me lots of times with projects. You just go too big too soon, makes a tiny splash and it disappears. Whereas if you went harder, deeper into a small area, you know, I haven't got any examples to mind, but that makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, definitely. Ali, thank you. That's been really useful. I'm going to ask you, one of the things we do in our podcast is to try and direct people to stuff that they could read or watch or look at that might connect with some of the things we've talked about today. So I'll give you 10 seconds to think about any recommendations of books or podcasts or Sport England stuff that you might want to reference. But thank you everyone who's listened. Really grateful for Ali for joining us today. You can find out more about Together an Active Future on our website, taaf.co.uk, and on Twitter we're at TaAF Talks. And Ali, perhaps over to you for anything that you would guide people to, and perhaps a final thought or a key takeaway message. I've just dropped another thing on you there.
I now can think of not a single book I've ever read in my entire life. I will tell people to go and Google the gov.uk design principles, because I think that is the best example of clear, succinct, consistent language that absolutely revolutionised the system. They were just good at communicating, and they all stuck to their principles. So go and have a look at that. In terms of anything else, I mean, comms is actually really simple when you think about it clearly. Clear message, know your audience, and then take your time going for it. It really isn't harder than that. I shouldn't say that because I try to make it sound complicated because it's my job, but it's actually quite straightforward.
Well, the hard thing is to make complicated things simple.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Lovely, thank you.
Thank you so much.